In Charleston, grief is treated like a spectator sport. The deeper your tragedy, the heavier the casseroles your neighbors drop on your porch. But there is a sharp line between supporting a grieving mother and treating her dead child like a bank account. My family did not just cross that line. They bought first-class tickets to Hawaii over it. My name is Ariadne Prescott. I am 33 years old. 14 months ago, my 7-year-old son, Leo, died of leukemia. The elementary school he attended raised $28,000 to create a memorial scholarship in his name. My parents demanded proxy access to the account too, as they said, help shoulder the burden of my grief. Before I tell you what I found when I checked that account on a Tuesday morning, please hit like and subscribe to Fluffy Revenge. Tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the morning I realized my family had spent my son's legacy on a sunburn. It was 6 in the morning. The air in my kitchen felt thick with the July humidity. I was holding a mug of black coffee, scrolling through my phone before heading to the clinic. I work as a medical and health services manager. My daily life revolves around federal compliance laws, Medicare regulations, and tracking funds down to the exact cent. Numbers tell a story. They do not lie, and they do not ask for forgiveness. A video popped up on my feed. My sister Vanessa. She was wearing a new designer swimsuit, holding a tropical drink in a hollowed-out pineapple. The geotag read, Maui, Hawaii. Behind her, out on the deck of a private catamaran, my mother Patricia and my father Charles were laughing. My mother wore a wide-brimmed sun hat. My father held up a glass of champagne to the camera. The caption read, Healing our hearts. Family time is the best medicine. My coffee went cold in my hand. My parents had been complaining about maxing out their credit cards for 6 months. Vanessa worked part-time at a boutique and spent her wages before the checks even cleared. Hawaii is not cheap. Private catamarans are not cheap. I set my mug on the granite counter. I did not call them. I did not leave a comment on the video. Instead, I opened my banking app on my laptop. I navigated to the linked external accounts. I clicked on the Leo Prescott Memorial Scholarship Fund. The screen loaded. The balance read $0.00. I opened the transaction history. The ledger scrolled down the screen in stark black and white. $4,000 to a luxury resort in Wailea. $2,000 to an airline. $800 to a high-end island tour company. Every single dollar raised by second graders selling bake sale cookies and teachers organizing car washes. Gone. Most mothers would scream. They would throw a glass against the wall. But I manage hospital budgets for a living. I know what happens when charity funds cross state lines for personal use. I sat at my kitchen table, placed my hands flat against the cool wood, and breathed in through my nose. I did not feel rage. I felt a terrifying surgical clarity. They actually thought they could hide behind Southern honor. They thought they could steal a dead child's memorial fund and smile for the camera. The phone vibrated against the granite countertop with a sharp mechanical buzz that seemed to slice right through the heavy morning humidity. The caller identification displayed the name Diane Gable. She was the principal at my son's former elementary school. She was also the woman who had held my hand in the hospital waiting room when the doctors first delivered the leukemia diagnosis. Diane had spearheaded the fundraising campaign organizing bake sales, community car washes, and silent auctions. She rallied teachers and parents to gather $28,000 to ensure Leo's name would live on through a memorial scholarship. I stared at her name flashing on my screen while the banking application on my laptop displayed a balance of 0. I cleared my throat and answered the call, keeping my voice steady. Diane sounded bright and enthusiastic. Her tone carried the specific warmth of someone who believes they are doing good in the world. She asked how I was holding up and mentioned how much the school still missed Leo. Then she pivoted to the logistics. The spring gala was exactly 21 days away. The school board had selected the first recipient for the Leo Prescott Memorial Scholarship. It was a second-grade boy from a low-income neighborhood who had just been diagnosed with a rare bone cancer. Diane explained that the funds would help his family cover their mounting travel expenses for out-of-state treatments. She asked if we could initiate the wire transfer by the end of the week so the school district could process the tax paperwork before the ceremony. A cold weight settled in my chest. The money raised to save another dying child had been spent on my parents' luxury vacation. The silence stretched on the line for 3 seconds. In Charleston, there is an unspoken rule stitched into the fabric of every historic home and country club. You protect the family reputation at all costs. Generational shame is the only unforgivable sin in South Carolina high society. The cultural conditioning I had absorbed since birth screamed at me to cover it up. As a medical and health services manager earning a lucrative salary, I had the personal savings to write a check right then and there. I could quietly replenish the stolen funds, smile for the cameras at the spring gala, and confront my parents behind closed doors where the neighbors would never hear. I could maintain the pristine Prescott facade. I looked at the transaction ledger on my screen. My father had withdrawn $3,000 in a single transaction and labeled the memo line as grief counseling. He used that exact sum to book a private catamaran charter in Maui. The instinct to protect my family vanished, leaving behind a clinical, sterile focus. I engaged the professional tone I use when auditing hospital compliance reports. I told Diane that I was currently running a standard compliance audit on the Memorial Trust. I explained that due to strict federal regulations regarding charitable disbursements, I needed to ensure every routing number and authorization code aligned perfectly with the tax requirements before initiating the final transfer. I asked for 3 weeks to finalize the paperwork, ensuring everything would be ready for the night of the gala. Diane praised my thoroughness. She told me Leo would be so proud of how carefully I was managing his legacy. We ended the call and the ticking clock began. I had exactly 21 days. Instead of breaking down, I went to work. I carried my laptop into my home office and connected it to my dual monitor setup. I handle Medicare compliance and trace millions of dollars in healthcare funding for a living. My father is a retired real estate broker who still types with 2 index fingers. He truly believed that moving money between digital accounts would hide his tracks. He was arrogant enough to assume I would never double-check the ledgers because I was too submerged in mourning. I downloaded 14 months of bank statements, converting the raw data into a pristine spreadsheet. I became a forensic investigator, operating within the wreckage of my own life. I pulled the login history and mapped the IP addresses associated with every transfer. The first unauthorized withdrawal occurred just 4 weeks after Leo's funeral. $5,000 moved into a joint checking account belonging to Charles and Patricia Prescott. I cross-referenced the date of that transfer with my sister Vanessa's social media timeline. On that exact afternoon, Vanessa posted a photo of herself holding shopping bags outside a Prada storefront in Atlanta. The caption mentioned retail therapy for a broken heart. The clinical collection of data served as my armor. I tracked a steady bleed of funds over the next year. $2,000 diverted to pay off a high-interest credit card. $800 withdrawn at an upscale salon in downtown Charleston. It painted a grotesque picture of their priorities. I remembered how they behaved during Leo's actual illness. They were highly performative grandparents. They would arrive at the pediatric oncology ward wearing sympathetic expressions, carrying expensive stuffed animals, just long enough to take photos for their social circles. When the grueling chemotherapy sessions began, and Leo would cry from the nausea, they would suddenly remember urgent appointments and excuse themselves. They could not handle the ugly reality of illness, but they were eager to harvest the social currency of being tragic figures. When Leo passed away, I was drowning in a level of grief that makes breathing feel like a chore. My parents stepped in with rehearsed efficiency. They convinced me to grant them proxy access to the memorial fund, insisting that dealing with bank tellers and administrative paperwork would be too triggering for a grieving mother. I handed them the keys to my son's legacy because I trusted them. They used my despair as a distraction to pick my pockets. I highlighted the final series of transactions. $12,000 drained in a single week. The payments went to a luxury airline resort, booking fees, and excursion vendors. This was the Hawaii trip. I matched the bank timestamps to the cheerful vacation photos Vanessa was currently broadcasting to her followers. They had funneled the charity money through their personal accounts, attempting to wash the funds before spending them. They failed to realize that every digital movement leaves an indelible scar on the banking server. By crossing state lines to purchase Hawaiian resort packages with stolen charity funds, they had escalated a family betrayal into federal wire fraud. I printed the documents. The printer hummed steadily, spitting out page after page of undeniable evidence. I stacked the warm sheets of paper and slid them into a crisp manila folder. There was no ambiguity left. My parents and my sister viewed my child's death as a financial windfall. They stole from a pediatric cancer fund to finance their vanity. I checked the flight tracking application on my phone. Their return flight from Maui had landed in Atlanta for a layover and was scheduled to arrive in Charleston by early afternoon. They would be pulling into the driveway of their pristine historic home within a few hours, expecting to unpack their souvenirs and boast about their healing journey. I closed my laptop and walked into my bedroom to change. I bypassed my casual weekend clothes and pulled out the sharp-tailored suit I wear for executive board meetings. I applied my makeup with careful precision, snapping my briefcase shut. It was time to drive across town and welcome my family home. The drive through the historic district of Charleston offers a masterclass in visual deception. Wrought iron gates guard pristine courtyards, while Spanish moss drapes over ancient oak trees, hiding the rot underneath the branches. The Prescott estate sits on a coveted corner south of Broad, serving as a towering monument to generational pretense. The exterior paint is flawless white. The shutters are a dark traditional green, and the wide wraparound porch is swept clean of any fallen leaves. Everything is meticulously curated to present an image of flawless Southern prosperity. But working in healthcare administration teaches you how to spot a failing system no matter how much cosmetic surgery has been applied to the surface. The airport rideshare vehicle pulled away just as I parked my sedan across the street. Charles, Patricia, and Vanessa were struggling to carry matching luxury luggage up the grand brick stairs. They wore vibrant floral resort wear and oversized designer sunglasses. Their skin glowed with expensive sunburns and the relaxed sheen of people who do not have a single care in the world. They looked like a television commercial promoting early retirement. I stepped out of my car wearing my structured navy business suit. My heels clicked a steady, unyielding rhythm against the cobblestone pavement. The sharp sound caused my father to turn around. His cheerful vacation smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and forced a bright, welcoming greeting. He asked why I was not at the clinic, acting as though we were about to enjoy a pleasant Sunday brunch together. I followed them inside without returning the greeting. The foyer air conditioning blasted cold, recycled air against my skin. The house smelled of stale floral arrangements and expensive floor wax. I bypassed the sweeping staircase and walked straight into the formal dining room. The dining table was a sprawling piece of antique mahogany. It was the exact spot where our family had gathered after Leo passed away, where my mother had wept loudly for the benefit of the catering staff, while I sat numb in the corner. I unclasped my briefcase. I pulled out the crisp manila folder containing the bank statements, the wire transfer logs, and the printed Instagram screenshots. I dropped the folder onto the center of the table. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet house, halting their cheerful chatter instantly. I told Charles to open the file. He sighed heavily, setting his woven straw fedora on a velvet chair. He treated my demand like an annoying interruption to his vacation glow. He flipped the cover open. His eyes tracked over the highlighted withdrawal columns, the federal routing codes, and the zero balance on the memorial fund. I watched his vital signs. As a medical professional, I automatically monitor breathing rates and subtle physical cues to assess a situation. His breathing did not quicken. His hands did not shake. His pupils did not dilate in panic. He simply frowned as if he had discovered a minor billing error on a restaurant receipt. He slid the papers across the polished wood toward my mother. Patricia picked up the top sheet and adjusted her reading glasses. When she realized what I had printed, Her posture shifted into a defensive crouch. She did not express horror. She did not offer a tearful apology. Instead, she deployed a psychological maneuver she had spent decades perfecting. She took a deep theatrical breath and pressed a hand to her chest. She claimed the grief of losing her only grandson was a toxic cloud suffocating this family. She said the silence in this cavernous house was slowly destroying her, and my father causing them unbearable physical anguish. She looked me dead in the eye and weaponized my dead child. She stated with supreme conviction that Leo was a creature of light and joy. She insisted he would have hated seeing his grandparents trapped in a cycle of dark depression. She argued that spending the money on a healing retreat was a tribute to his vibrant spirit. She reframed the embezzlement of cancer charity funds as a spiritual necessity. My lungs felt tight, but my face remained a smooth, unreadable mask. I was witnessing a staggering display of narcissistic deflection. She actually believed her own narrative. She had convinced herself that stealing donations gathered by elementary school teachers was a righteous act of mourning. Vanessa strolled into the dining room, sipping imported water from a glass bottle. She had changed into a silk lounge set. My sister had never maintained a real career relying on our parents to fund her lifestyle, while portraying herself as a wellness influencer on social media. She leaned over our mother to glance at the banking ledger. She rolled her eyes and groaned in profound annoyance. She complained that I was causing an unnecessary scene over a mediocre trip. She whined that the stolen money did not even cover premium airfare. She stated she was forced to endure a 9-hour flight in coach surrounded by noisy passengers, which severely triggered her own emotional trauma regarding her nephew. She had the sheer audacity to act shortchanged. She felt $28,000 was inadequate compensation for her performative grief. Charles stepped in to restore order, playing the role of the wise patriarch. He used the condescending tone he reserved for women who challenged his authority. He waved a dismissive hand over the stack of evidence, telling me to stop acting like a dramatic prosecuting attorney. He reframed the federal crime as a temporary cash flow maneuver. He explained that his real estate investments were currently tied up in escrow, preventing him from accessing liquid capital for their urgent mental health vacation. He called the withdrawal a simple family advance. He promised he would repay the memorial account before the school gala taking place in a few weeks. He treated a registered tax-exempt charity like a personal overdraft facility, assuming the federal laws did not apply to men of his social standing in Charleston. I stood at the head of the antique table and absorbed their delusions. A less disciplined woman might have flipped the table or screamed until her throat bled. I did neither. My clinical training provided a protective shield, allowing me to detach from the emotional horror of the moment. I evaluated the three of them standing there in their resort wear, radiating unearned privilege and profound moral decay. They did not see a grieving mother standing before them. They saw a rigid, inconvenient obstacle to their entitlement. They expected me to yell. They expected a chaotic, emotional argument that would eventually end in a tearful, reluctant compromise, where we all agreed to keep the secret. My silence unnerved them more than any accusation ever could. I did not ask them to return the cash. I did not threaten to call the police or alert the media. I snapped my empty briefcase shut, leaving the printed copies of their financial crimes scattered across the mahogany wood. I turned my back on them and walked out the heavy front door into the sweltering afternoon heat. My mind was sharp and clear. The emotional ties that bound me to this family severed cleanly in that dining room. The trap was fully constructed, and I knew with chilling certainty that my mother was about to make her next move. 2 days passed in unbroken silence before the summons arrived. It was not a phone call or a text message. Patricia operated with a level of theatrical formality designed to control the battlefield. She dispatched a courier to my clinic with a heavy cream envelope. Inside was a reservation card for the dining room at the elite Charleston Harbor Club. The reservation was set for high noon on a Thursday. In my mother's world, inviting someone to a private club during peak lunch hours was a tactical maneuver. High society luncheons are public spaces governed by unspoken laws of decorum. You do not raise your voice over heirloom tomato salad. You do not cause a disruption while the wives of city councilmen are seated 2 tables away. My mother was using the weight of Southern etiquette as a shield. She knew I would not create a scene in a room filled with local dignitaries. I arrived at the club wearing a tailored charcoal sheath dress. The valet took my keys and I stepped into the grand foyer. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh magnolias. Patricia had spent her entire adult life cultivating her status within these walls. She served on charity boards, hosted seasonal galas, and spent thousands of dollars annually just to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. Our family was not old money, but my parents had bankrupted their actual finances trying to mimic it. They prioritized outward perception over internal reality at every turn. I handed my coat to the attendant and walked into the sunlit dining room. Patricia was already seated at a corner table with a panoramic view of the water. She wore a pristine pastel linen suit and sipped sparkling water with a slice of lime. To the untrained eye, she looked like a grieving grandmother bravely facing the day. Several women paused at her table to touch her shoulder, offering hushed sympathies. Patricia bowed her head, accepting their condolences with a practiced, mournful grace. I watched her perform her sorrow, knowing she had just returned from spending $28,000 of pediatric cancer donations on tropical cocktails and boat tours. The disconnect between her public performance and her private corruption was staggering. I approached the table and took my seat. She did not offer a greeting. She waited until the waiter filled my water glass and retreated out of earshot. She adjusted her silk napkin across her lap. She kept her posture relaxed and her facial expression pleasant, ensuring that anyone observing us from across the room would assume we were having a polite mother and daughter catch-up. Then she leaned forward slightly across the white tablecloth. Her voice dropped to a quiet, conspiratorial whisper. She informed me that my father had spoken with his accountant. She said the real estate capital he had promised to use to repay the memorial fund was regrettably tied up in a complicated escrow situation. She delivered this lie smoothly, without a single twitch of guilt. She explained that Charles would not be able to liquidate his assets before the school gala. The event was fast approaching. The principal was expecting a ceremonial check. The school district required the physical transfer of funds. Patricia took a delicate sip of her water. She placed the glass down and locked her eyes onto mine. The mask of the grieving grandmother vanished entirely. In its place was a calculating predator cornering her prey. She stated that the family was in a slight administrative bind, and it was my duty to resolve the issue. The conflict morphed from deflection into direct extortion. Patricia laid out her demands with chilling precision. She pointed out that I held a highly lucrative position as a medical and health services manager. She reminded me that my annual salary comfortably exceeded $101,000. She noted that because I lived alone and maintained a modest lifestyle, I possessed significant liquid savings. She ordered me to log into my personal banking portal and wire $28,000 to the school district trust account by the end of the week. She did not ask for a loan. She did not frame it as a favor. She demanded I cover the cost of their Hawaiian vacation under the guise of protecting the Prescott name. She invoked the concept of Southern honor. In Charleston, she whispered, "Reputation is the only currency that matters." She painted a vivid picture of the social ruin that would follow if the elementary school discovered the memorial fund was empty. She said our family would be exiled from polite society. We would be pariahs. She placed the burden of preventing this social apocalypse squarely onto my shoulders. I analyzed her tactic. She was taking the crimes she and my father had committed and handing me the mop to clean it up. But she was not finished. A skilled manipulator always ensures the victim has something personal to lose. Patricia leaned in closer. Her voice grew sharper, carrying the unmistakable edge of a threat. She reminded me that my entire career in healthcare administration relied on my pristine ethical record. I managed federal Medicare funds and hospital budgets. She smiled a thin, menacing smile. She suggested that if a scandal broke regarding the embezzlement of my own dead son's cancer charity, it would not just destroy the Prescott family reputation. She argued that the sheer proximity to charity fraud would trigger a devastating fallout for my professional life. She said the hospital board would not care who actually spent the money. They would only see my name associated with a horrific financial crime involving a pediatric fund. She promised that if the truth came out, I would be stripped of my credentials, fired from my managerial position, and blacklisted from the medical community across the entire state of South Carolina. She sat back in her chair and smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her sleeve. She was confident in her strategy. She was banking on my lifelong habit of remaining silent to keep the peace. She assumed my fear of public humiliation and professional ruin would compel me to quietly surrender my own hard-earned money to save them. This is the insidious nature of familial abuse. The abuser relies on the victim's moral compass to secure their own immunity. They know the victim cares about consequences, so they use that care as a weapon. My heart beat at a steady, even pace. My clinical training kept my physiology perfectly regulated. I evaluated the woman sitting across from me. She had used the memory of my deceased 7-year-old boy to buy a luxury vacation and was now threatening my livelihood to avoid paying the bill. She had stripped away any lingering shred of familial loyalty I might have harbored. The extortion attempt was the final diagnostic proof I needed. The rot was terminal. There was no saving this relationship. I did not argue. Defending myself would only give her the satisfaction of a debate. I did not point out the gaping holes in her logic, or the fact that federal wire fraud leaves a digital trail that no amount of Southern honor can erase. I simply reached for the tall glass of iced sweet tea the waiter had placed beside my plate. The condensation cooled my fingertips. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The sugar burned the back of my throat. I set the glass down softly on the linen coaster. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. I gave her a single polite, non-committal nod. The gesture was ambiguous enough to mean anything, but to a woman who expects total submission, she interpreted it as compliance. Patricia relaxed her shoulders, exhaling a breath of triumph. Her smile returned bright and victorious. She signaled the waiter to bring the dessert menu, believing she had successfully bullied me into funding her crime. She had no idea that my silence was not a surrender. It was the sound of a steel trap clicking shut. She had just provided me with the ultimate confirmation of their deliberate intent. She had clarified the stakes. By demanding I cover their tracks, she confirmed they had no intention of rectifying the theft themselves. I picked up my fork and allowed her to enjoy her victory luncheon. Let her eat cake. Let her match her shoes for the upcoming gala. I would not be transferring a single cent of my savings to cover their Hawaiian vacation. I would be doing something much more effective. I would use my professional expertise to build an inescapable legal cage, and I would begin drafting the blueprints the moment I returned to my office. I walked out of the Charleston Harbor Club and handed my valet ticket to the parking attendant. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, but my core temperature felt like ice. I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan and merged onto the highway, heading back to the medical center. My mother believed she had won the confrontation. She believed the threat of social exile would secure my submission. She fundamentally misunderstood the environment I operate in every single day. At 33 years old, I oversee the administrative infrastructure for a vast network of outpatient clinics. My daily responsibilities involve parsing federal funding guidelines, managing Medicare audits, and ensuring our facilities adhere to the strictest legal protocols in the healthcare industry. I do not deal in Southern etiquette or polite suggestions. I deal in hard data regulatory compliance and federal law. When a hospital billing discrepancy arises, I do not sweep it under a rug to save someone from embarrassment. I dissect the financial anatomy of the error until the naked truth is exposed. I decided to apply that exact same diagnostic rigor to my own parents. Arriving at my office, I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. I bypassed my afternoon emails and opened a secured encrypted file on my desktop. I needed to establish the exact legal framework of my son's memorial fund. I had retained digital copies of all the founding documents from the elementary school. I pulled up the original charter. Diane Gable had been incredibly thorough when she established the account. The Leo Prescott Memorial Scholarship was not a casual neighborhood cash pool. It was formally registered as a certified extension of the school district's tax-exempt umbrella. The paperwork clearly displayed the official nonprofit tax identification number assigned by the government. I stared at the federal designation glowing on my monitor. The classification shifted the entire landscape of this betrayal. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a borrowed inheritance. By siphoning $28,000 from a registered charity, my father had crossed a severe legal threshold. The moment Charles moved those specific dollars from the Memorial Trust into his private checking account, he committed felony embezzlement. The moment he wired those stolen funds across state lines to purchase resort packages and catamaran rentals in Maui, he triggered the criteria for federal wire fraud. Charity fraud in this jurisdiction is not handled with a polite slap on the wrist. When funds intended for pediatric cancer patients are misappropriated, the Attorney General pursues the maximum penalty. My parents were gambling with years of incarceration without even realizing they had stepped up to the table. They had treated my dead child's legacy like a slush fund, assuming the shield of our family name would grant them immunity. In Charleston, high society wealthy individuals often believe their status exempts them from the consequences of their actions. They view the law as something that happens to other people. My parents thought they were participating in a high-stakes social game, where the worst possible outcome was a bruised reputation and some awkward whispers at the country club. They were entirely oblivious to the reality that they were playing a lethal legal game against the federal government. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and made a cold, calculated decision. I would not transfer a single penny of my own salary to replenish that account. Paying the money would make me an accessory to their crime. It would validate my mother's extortion and reinforce their delusion that they could exploit my grief without penalty. I refused to be their financial shield. Instead, I would become their archivist. I initiated a fresh document on my computer and began assembling a pristine, undeniable dossier. I started with the bank routing numbers. I captured high-resolution screenshots of every unauthorized withdrawal matching the exact timestamps to the corresponding deposits in my father's personal account. The digital trail was unbroken and glaringly obvious. A first-year accounting student could spot the fraud in under 3 minutes. I carefully labeled each digital folder, ensuring the nomenclature matched standard evidentiary formats. Transparency is paramount in any audit, and I intended to provide the authorities with a roadmap that required zero additional navigation. Next, I needed to connect the stolen funds directly to the Hawaiian vacation. I opened Vanessa's public social media profile. My sister had spent her entire adult life broadcasting her location, her purchases, and her vanity to the internet. She had practically handed me the prosecution evidence on a silver platter. I captured images of her flight boarding passes, which she had carelessly posted to her stories showing the dates and the airline carrier. I matched the airline charge on my father's bank statement to the exact day those tickets were purchased. I archived her posts from the luxury resort in Wailea Cross, referencing the hotel billing codes with the stolen charity funds. Every mixed tropical drink, every sunset dinner, every designer beach towel was meticulously cataloged and tied directly to the depleted scholarship account. I looked at the vibrant turquoise waters in my sister's photographs, contrasting sharply with the sterile white walls of my clinic office. The disparity highlighted their profound lack of empathy. My meticulous nature was forged in the pediatric oncology ward. When Leo was first diagnosed, I had to navigate a labyrinth of insurance approvals, experimental treatment codes, and predatory billing departments. I learned very quickly that emotion gets you nowhere in a bureaucratic system. Documentation is the only currency that commands respect. I spent months organizing Leo's medical charts, fighting for every hour of his care. That grueling experience stripped away my tolerance for incompetence and deceit. I was applying the very skills I learned trying to save my son to dismantle the people who were now desecrating his memory. I printed the entire collection of evidence. The heavy office printer hummed a rhythmic mechanical tune as it produced page after page of undeniable guilt. I organized the sheets chronologically, placing the official tax documents at the front, followed by the banking ledgers, and concluding with Vanessa's vacation photographs. I slid the thick stack of paper into a heavy-duty manila envelope and sealed it tight. I then copied the digital files onto 2 separate encrypted flash drives. I locked one drive in my office safe and placed the second drive alongside the physical dossier inside my briefcase. I was building a cage of raw data, and there would be no escaping it once the latch released. The spring gala was looming on the horizon. My mother was likely at home right now, coordinating her accessories for the event, confident that her luncheon threat had secured my submission. She believed my silence indicated surrender. I sat in my quiet office watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. I felt no panic regarding the empty charity account. The money was gone, but the trap was perfectly set. I just needed to let the system operate as it was designed to function. I was finalizing my daily reports when the receptionist buzzed my intercom to announce an unexpected visitor. Vanessa had arrived at the clinic carrying a bright shopping bag and wearing a wide, oblivious smile, unaware that she was walking directly into the center of my meticulously constructed snare. The heavy oak door to my office swung open without a knock. Vanessa sailed into the sterile clinical environment, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a brightly patterned sundress that belonged on a boardwalk rather than a medical facility. She carried an iced matcha latte in one hand and a crinkled tropical gift bag in the other. My sister operated under the delusion that the world was a soundstage built specifically for her daily performance. She had spent her 20s bouncing between vague entrepreneurial ventures funded entirely by our parents, treating every failure as a tragic plot twist in her personal narrative. She dropped the neon gift bag onto my polished desk, disrupting the neat arrangement of my compliance reports. She offered a theatrical sigh and collapsed into the leather guest chair, crossing her tanned legs. She slid her sunglasses up into her hair and smiled a bright, empty smile. She announced she had brought me a token of appreciation from her healing journey. I reached forward and pulled the item from the crinkling tissue paper. It was a resin sea turtle keychain attached to a flimsy metal ring. The paint on the shell was already chipping at the edges. I turned it over and noted the sticky white residue where a clearance price tag had been hastily peeled off. It was a cheap, mass-produced trinket manufactured in a distant factory and sold near the airport registers. I looked at the crude plastic object and thought about the $28,000 missing from a pediatric cancer fund. This $4 piece of plastic was the sole return on investment for my dead son's legacy. I placed the sea turtle gently onto my desk. I offered a measured, polite thank you. Vanessa did not notice the hollow nature of my gratitude. She was already pivoting the conversation toward her favorite subject, which was her own inconvenience. She began to complain about the staggering prices at the Hawaiian resort. She whined that the oceanfront cabana rentals required exorbitant daily fees, and the imported seafood dinners drained their daily budget far quicker than they anticipated. She audibly groaned about the cost of premium cocktail service on the catamaran. Listening to her lament the high cost of luxury travel while sitting across from the sister whose child financed the trip required a superhuman level of physiological control. I regulated my breathing, keeping my heart rate slow and steady. I watched her lips move, marveling at the sheer depth of her entitlement. She was oblivious to the fact that her complaints were detailed verbal confessions of wire fraud. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on my desk, and lowered her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. She deployed a pout she had perfected in middle school. She explained that the restorative retreat had tapped out her checking account. She said she had an upcoming collaboration with a local lifestyle brand and needed new outfits to maintain her aesthetic. Without a trace of irony, she asked if I could float her a few $100s to tide her over until the end of the month. She framed it as a tiny favor between sisters, assuming my lucrative salary made me a limitless resource. I maintained steady eye contact. I informed her in a cool, level tone that my personal budget was locked into strict investments for the quarter, leaving me with zero liquid cash for personal loans. I watched the disappointment wash over her face. She huffed in annoyance, picking at her manicured fingernails. She complained that no one in this family ever supported her creative endeavors. To prove her diligent work ethic, she pulled out her smartphone and tapped the screen, holding it up for me to see. She boasted that she had been working tirelessly during her entire vacation. She instructed me to check her social media channels because she had just published a highly anticipated vlog documenting her grief journey. She bragged about the engagement metrics, claiming her follower count had spiked overnight due to the emotional vulnerability of the content. She tossed her empty latte cup into my wastebasket, gathered her designer purse, and swept out of the office, declaring she had a fitting downtown. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the quiet chill of my office. I turned back to my dual monitors. I opened a private browser window and navigated to her public video channel. I located the most recent upload. The thumbnail image featured Vanessa sitting on a white sand beach, gazing mournfully at a vibrant tropical sunset. I clicked play. The video began with a 30-second unskippable advertisement for a high-end skincare brand. My sister had monetized the upload, ensuring that every view generated advertising revenue directly into her personal account. The video faded from the commercial into a montage of sweeping drone shots over the Hawaiian coastline, accompanied by somber royalty-free piano music. Vanessa appeared on screen wearing a flowing white dress. She spoke directly to the camera, delivering a tearful monologue about the crushing weight of losing her nephew. She touched her chest and spoke about how the ocean waves reminded her of Leo's fleeting beautiful life. She told her followers that healing requires intentional space and premium self-care. The footage cut to her clinking champagne glasses with our parents on a private yacht. It shifted to her lounging by an infinity pool, typing reflections into a leather-bound journal. She weaponized my tragedy, transforming the horrific death of a 7-year-old boy into a lucrative digital product designed to farm sympathy and generate sponsorship deals. Any microscopic sliver of residual guilt I might have harbored regarding the impending destruction of her life vanished in that exact moment. For years, I had justified her behavior, attributing her selfishness to immaturity or a lack of direction. I had tried to be the responsible older sibling who absorbed the shockwaves of her careless choices. Watching her perform fake grief on a beach funded by stolen cancer donations eradicated those old family loyalties. The sisterly bond was not just broken, it was entirely incinerated. They viewed my child's death merely as social currency. I did not close the browser. I launched my professional screen recording software. I captured the entire 15-minute video, ensuring the recording caught the sponsored advertising segments, the engagement statistics, and the timestamp of the upload. I documented the specific brand deals she promoted during the video, linking her corporate sponsorships to content financed by embezzled charity funds. I saved the digital file, applying a secure encryption protocol. I dragged the video file into the master folder containing the bank ledgers, the flight receipts, and the federal tax documents. I picked up the resin sea turtle keychain from my desk. The cheap plastic felt gritty against my skin. It was the perfect physical manifestation of their moral bankruptcy. I walked over to my leather briefcase resting on the side chair. I popped the brass clasps and opened the thick manila envelope containing the printed evidence of their felonies. I dropped the keychain inside. It landed against the stack of paper with a muted, hollow thud. I sealed the envelope and locked the briefcase. The workday slowly transitioned into evening. I finished my clinic reports and drove home through the historic Charleston streets, unbothered by the heavy southern heat. I slept that night with a profound, untroubled peace. The emotional turmoil of mourning had been replaced by the structured discipline of an ongoing audit. I woke up the following morning and poured a cup of black coffee, preparing for a routine administrative meeting. The morning sun cast bright geometric shadows across my kitchen floor. I was reviewing a quarterly budget spreadsheet when my cell phone vibrated on the table. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from Diane Gable. The principal of the elementary school was calling much earlier than our scheduled check-in. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. The digital snare I had built was about to be tested. I answered the call and listened as the first domino tipped forward. The morning sun filtered through the heavy blinds of my office, casting sharp, geometric lines across my mahogany desk. My phone display illuminated with an incoming call. The screen read, Diane Gable. The timing was highly irregular for a primary education administrator. Principals are usually standing at the drop-off curb, greeting students and managing the chaotic influx of yellow buses at this hour. I answered the device expecting a quick logistical question about the upcoming memorial presentation at the gala. Instead, I heard a sharp, desperate intake of breath. Diane sounded as though she had just run a marathon in the suffocating coastal humidity. Her usual polished, cheerful cadence was replaced by a trembling, breathless whisper. She asked if I was sitting down in a safe, private place. I pushed my rolling chair back from the desk and focused my attention entirely on the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Diane explained that the school district finance director had arrived early to run a preliminary reconciliation report. The spring gala was fast approaching, and the district needed to verify the exact total in the Leo Prescott Memorial Scholarship Fund to print the ceremonial presentation check. The finance director bypassed the standard monthly mailed statement and logged directly into the auxiliary charity portal linked to the district banking network. Diane paused, her voice wavering so severely I could hear the static over the cellular connection. She said the portal showed a zero balance. She had driven straight to the district central office to view the computer screen herself. She described staring at the empty digital ledger, unable to comprehend how $28,000 had vanished into thin air. In the realm of public education, mishandling donated capital is a catastrophic career-ending event. It invites immediate harsh media scrutiny and destroys vital community trust. Diane had personally championed this fundraiser. She had encouraged young children to empty their piggy banks and inspired teachers to donate portions of their modest paychecks to honor a student taken far too soon. The sudden disappearance of a registered charity fund falls under strict regulatory oversight. Diane sounded paralyzed by fear. She begged me to confirm that this was merely a routine banking delay. She suggested maybe I had moved the money into a higher-yield savings account, or perhaps a wire transfer was temporarily stalled in a financial clearinghouse. She practically pleaded for a simple clerical explanation to make the terrifying nightmare go away. Generations of ingrained Charleston conditioning urged me to protect the Prescott name at all costs. The unwritten social contract of my upbringing demanded that I invent a plausible excuse cover the shortfall with my own hard-earned salary and shield my parents from a very public disgrace. But my daily reality as a medical and health services manager dictates a very different set of operational rules. I deal with Medicare audits, patient assistance grants, and federal funding streams. I know firsthand that when federal regulations are breached, covering up the discrepancy makes you an active participating accomplice in the fraud. I evaluated the frantic woman on the other end of the line. Diane had cared for my son with genuine compassion. She had honored his memory with her tireless efforts. She did not deserve to carry the heavy legal and emotional burden of my family and their grotesque corruption. I kept my voice measured and even delivering the harsh diagnosis with clinical precision. I told Diane there was no banking error. I stated clearly that the funds had been misappropriated by the proxy holders. The line went dead silent. The silence stretched for several agonizing heartbeats as her mind slowly processed the legal definition of my words. The proxy holders on the account were Charles and Patricia Prescott. They were prominent local figures who attended all the right charity functions and wore the appropriate tailored suits. Diane struggled to articulate her next question. She asked in a hushed, horrified tone if I meant my parents had taken the money intended for sick children. I confirmed her tragic realization without softening the blow. I did not let her spiral further into panic. I took control of the conversation, instructing her on the exact protocol we were going to follow to ensure her safety. I told her she must notify the district legal counsel immediately and proceed with the mandatory financial audit by the book. When a registered tax-exempt account is drained without authorized charitable disbursements, it triggers an automatic alert to state authorities and the Internal Revenue Service. I assured her she would not face this bureaucratic storm unarmed. I explained that I had anticipated this discovery and spent the past several days compiling a comprehensive evidentiary file to exonerate the school of any liability and direct the investigators to the true culprits. While keeping Diane on the phone, I navigated to my encrypted digital vault on my workstation. I opened my secure email client and composed a new high-priority message. I typed in the official address for the school district's general counsel. I added a carbon copy directly to the South Carolina Attorney General Charity Fraud Division. The subject line was clear, concise, and devoid of emotion, noting the unauthorized depletion of the specified Memorial Trust Fund. I attached the thick digital dossier I had constructed over the past week. I watched the progress bar as the heavy file uploaded to the server. The payload contained the tracing of the banking routing numbers, the matching airline flight receipts, the timestamps of the luxury resort purchases, and the screen-recorded video of Vanessa monetizing her fake grief on a Hawaiian beach. I explained to Diane that the attached file contained an unbroken chain of forensic evidence proving felony embezzlement and wire fraud. I advised her to hand the matter entirely over to the authorities and step safely away from the blast radius. The state investigators do not care about exclusive country club memberships or historic lineages south of Broad Street. They operate on cold, hard financial data. Once they received my email, they would issue immediate subpoenas for my parents' personal bank records. The investigative machinery is relentless and blind to social status. Charles and Patricia had assumed they were invincible, but they had just triggered a federal tripwire that would decimate their lives. The upload completed with a soft digital chime. I clicked send. The transmission launched through the secure server, leaving my outbox and landing simultaneously on the desks of school attorneys and state prosecutors. I felt a profound physical release as the email confirmed its delivery. I had officially removed myself as the protective barrier between my family and the consequences of their heinous actions. The burden of their crime no longer rested on my shoulders in any capacity. It was now entirely in the hands of the criminal justice system. Diane wept quietly on the phone. Her tears were a stark contrast to my dry eyes. She apologized repeatedly for the violation of Leo and his beautiful memory. I comforted her with the firm assurance that the people responsible would be held fully accountable under the law. We ended the call with a mutual understanding of the storm that was about to break. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and looked out the window at the bustling clinic parking lot. The city went about its morning routine, ignorant of the silent legal detonation that had just occurred within its digital infrastructure. The massive boulder had been pushed off the precipice. It was gathering incredible speed and momentum, rolling straight toward the Prescott estate. The authorities would soon begin freezing assets, preparing indictments, and drafting arrest warrants. Yet my family remained blissfully oblivious at the bottom of the hill. They were currently coordinating their outfits and making dinner reservations for a celebratory family meal scheduled for that very evening. I gathered my belongings, sliding my phone into my leather purse. I needed to attend that dinner to play my part in their grand illusion, maintaining a flawless poker face, while the unseen avalanche rushed down to bury them all. The evening air in Charleston hung thick with humidity, and the scent of blooming jasmine as I pulled my sedan into the circular driveway of my parents' estate. The imposing white columns of the historic home stood illuminated by perfectly angled landscape lighting. To any passerby, the property projected an image of untroubled generational prosperity. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet vehicle for a moment. My pulse was remarkably steady. I had just initiated a state-level investigation that would dismantle the lives of the people waiting inside that house. Yet I felt no apprehension. My clinical training had fully overridden my familial instincts, leaving only a cold, objective focus. I grabbed my purse and walked up the brick steps, ready to play my designated role in their grand illusion. The heavy mahogany front door opened before I could turn the brass knob. Patricia stood in the foyer, wearing an expression of radiant triumph. She ushered me inside with a practiced theatrical hug that smelled of expensive perfume and gin. The dining room beyond the foyer was a masterclass in Southern excess. The long table was set with heirloom silver crystal goblets and a sprawling floral centerpiece that must have cost several $100s. Charles was already seated at the head of the table, pouring a dark vintage red wine into fragile stemware. Vanessa slouched in a chair to his right, tapping furiously on her smartphone screen. The atmosphere in the room was electric with unearned victory. Because I had maintained strict radio silence since our luncheon at the Harbor Club, they had drawn a deeply flawed conclusion. In their world, a lack of argument signified surrender. They genuinely believed that the crushing pressure of preserving our social standing had forced my hand. They assumed I had logged into my personal banking portal and quietly wired my own hard-earned salary to the elementary school to replenish the stolen memorial funds. They thought I had paid the ransom to shield them from public ruin. Their arrogance was so profound they did not even consider the possibility that a daughter raised in this culture of secrecy would ever choose the law over her bloodline. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table. A private catering service had prepared the meal. I picked up my silver fork and knife, slicing into the roasted tenderloin with surgical precision. I chewed my food methodically, listening as my father held court. Charles took a generous sip of his wine and leaned back in his upholstered chair. His face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of consequence-free theft. He began boasting about a meeting he had scheduled for the following afternoon with a premier marine broker. He detailed his plans to purchase a customized center console boat equipped with dual outboard engines and premium leather seating. Listening to him casually discuss luxury watercraft purchases required a distinct level of psychological detachment. He had drained an account funded by second graders, saving their allowance money to honor my dead son. He had spent that charity cash on a Hawaiian vacation, and now he felt emboldened to expand his fleet. He viewed his ability to manipulate me as a renewed line of credit. If he could force me to cover a $28,000 felony, he assumed he could push me to finance his ongoing lifestyle. He chuckled warmly, telling Vanessa that they would take the new boat out to the harbor islands by mid-summer. My sister barely glanced up from her glowing screen. She muttered a distracted note of approval before shifting the conversation to her own vanity. She complained that the lighting in the dining room was terrible for her social media updates. She then gleefully informed the table that her follower engagement metrics had skyrocketed since she posted her fabricated grief journey videos from Maui. She had successfully monetized Leo, and she was currently negotiating a sponsorship deal with a boutique swimwear line based on the sympathy she had farmed from strangers. I took a sip of my water, letting the cool liquid wash over my dry throat. I did not offer a single word of critique. I simply allowed them to incriminate themselves further in the quiet theater of my mind. Patricia decided it was time to redirect the spotlight back onto her own impending performance. She pushed her chair back and instructed us to wait. She hurried up the grand staircase and returned moments later carrying a heavy garment bag. With a flourish, she unzipped the canvas to reveal a floor-length designer evening gown. The fabric was a rich sapphire silk adorned with intricate hand-stitched beadwork along the bodice. She held the dress against her frame, twirling slightly so the chandelier light caught the sparkling embellishments. She announced that she had purchased the gown specifically for the Spring Memorial Gala, occurring in exactly 1 week. She spent the next 15 minutes detailing the matching designer heels she had ordered and the salon appointments she had booked for the morning of the event. She was treating a pediatric cancer charity dinner like a red carpet premiere. She painted a vivid picture of the moment she and Charles would be called to the stage. She practiced her mournful yet stoic expression, anticipating the thunderous applause from the Charleston elite. She imagined the wealthy surgeons and politicians gazing up at her in admiration, viewing her as the resilient philanthropic matriarch, turning her tragedy into a beacon of hope. The dramatic irony saturating the dining room was thick enough to suffocate a lesser person. I sat quietly analyzing the stark contrast between their delusion and the impending reality. They were gleefully matching imported shoes to their stolen success. Meanwhile, mere miles away in a sterile government building, financial investigators from the South Carolina Attorney General office were actively pulling their bank records. Forensic accountants were currently matching the routing numbers from the elementary school trust directly to Charles and Patricia's joint checking account. State prosecutors were drafting subpoenas to seize their assets. The invisible machinery of the justice system was grinding its gears, closing in around this dining table. But my family remained happily oblivious, deaf to the sirens that were already sounding in the distance. Patricia draped the sapphire gown carefully over an empty chair. She returned to her seat and picked up her wineglass. She offered me a patronizing maternal smile, the kind of smile reserved for an obedient subordinate who has successfully completed a grueling task. She tilted her head and asked if I had finalized the administrative paperwork with the school district. She inquired if I was prepared for the gala next week, ensuring that our family would be presented in the best possible light. I set my cutlery down, crossing my hands in my lap. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. I did not flinch. I did not waver. I kept my voice smooth and professional, mimicking the tone I used to confirm a successful hospital audit. I told her that she did not need to worry about a single detail. I promised her that the financial logs had been submitted and the authorities had received everything they required. I smiled a thin, chilling smile and stated that everything is perfectly in order. Patricia beamed with profound relief, missing the dual meaning of my words entirely. She raised her glass to toast my diligence, congratulating me on handling the situation with the discretion expected of a Prescott. Charles echoed the sentiment, draining the last of his vintage wine. The dinner concluded in a haze of sickening self-congratulation. The plates were cleared and Vanessa retreated upstairs to photograph her promotional merchandise. I prepared to gather my belongings and return to the quiet sanctuary of my own home. But just as I picked up my purse, Charles intercepted me in the hallway. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and dropped his cheerful facade, adopting a serious, commanding tone. He asked me to step into his private study for a brief business chat before I departed, setting the stage for an encounter that would push his arrogance past the point of no return. The heavy warmth of my father's hand on my shoulder guided me away from the foyer and down the dimly lit hallway toward his private study. This room served as the nerve center of his dictatorial regime. The air inside smelled of stale cigar smoke, polished leather, and ancient entitlement. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, displaying legal texts and real estate manuals he had not opened in a decade. Charles walked behind his massive oak desk and sank into a tufted leather executive chair. He gestured for me to sit in one of the low, uncomfortable guest seats positioned opposite him. It was a classic power dynamic tactic designed to make the visitor feel small and subordinate. I remained standing. He steepled his fingers, resting his elbows on the polished wood surface. The jovial, wine-flushed demeanor he had exhibited in the dining room vanished. He adopted the crisp transactional tone of a broker closing a difficult deal. He informed me that the recent Hawaiian excursion, coupled with my mother's lavish preparations for the upcoming memorial gala, had temporarily constrained their fiscal agility. He used the phrase "maxed our liquidity" to describe a situation where they had simply squandered stolen money on sheer vanity. He explained that purchasing the new customized boat required immediate capital, and his current assets were locked in complex escrow accounts. He opened a side drawer and produced a crisp printed document, sliding it across the desk toward me. I recognized the banking logo at the top of the page. It was a guarantor agreement for a high-yield line of credit. Charles expected me to leverage my six-figure healthcare administration salary to co-sign a loan for his luxury watercraft. He leaned forward, expecting me to blindly accept the pen he was offering. He assumed that because I had supposedly covered his tracks with the school district, I was now a fully compliant participant in his financial ecosystem. I looked at the banking form and then looked directly into his eyes. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I told him I would not be signing any financial documents or assuming any liability for his personal purchases. The rejection hit him like a physical blow. In his carefully curated universe, women did not deny him. He blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening as the reality of my refusal registered. The veneer of the supportive patriarch evaporated, revealing the cold, calculating manipulator underneath. He lowered his voice, issuing a quiet warning about the importance of family loyalty and the dangers of selfishness. He reminded me of the expensive private education he had provided for me decades ago, expecting a lifetime return on that investment. I did not engage with his revisionist history. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the study, leaving the unsigned contract sitting on his desk. I drove back to my own home, navigating the quiet Charleston streets with a steady pulse. I knew Charles would not accept defeat gracefully. Men who build their identities on dominance always escalate when challenged. The retaliation arrived 2 days later, just 48 hours before the spring gala. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing clinic staffing schedules when my laptop chimed with an incoming email notification. The sender was my father. I opened the message. Charles had abandoned all pretense of polite negotiation. The email was a blatant extortion attempt delivered with staggering arrogance. He stated that if I did not visit his preferred bank branch by Friday afternoon to sign the guarantor paperwork, he would be forced to make a very difficult public disclosure. He outlined a fabricated narrative he planned to spread among the country club elite and the elementary school board. He intended to claim that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown following the tragic loss of my son. He planned to tell the Charleston high society that in my grief-stricken state, I had grossly mismanaged Leo's little charity thing. Reading those specific words caused a sharp physical pain in my chest. He reduced my dead son's memorial fund to a trivial inconvenience. He was threatening to drag my professional and personal reputation through the mud, branding me an incompetent grieving mother who embezzled her own child's legacy. He believed this ultimatum would break my resolve. He thought the terror of social exile and career destruction would send me running to the bank to secure his luxury boat. He made a fatal strategic error. Charles was a man of the analog era. He secured deals with handshakes on golf courses and verbal agreements over expensive bourbon. He possessed zero understanding of digital permanence. He did not comprehend that putting a threat in writing creates an indelible, unalterable record. I did not react with anger. I recognized the email as the final key needed to lock the prison door. The state investigators already possessed the bank routing numbers and the transfer logs showing the movement of the stolen funds. However, defense attorneys often try to argue that such transfers were simple accounting mistakes or unauthorized bank errors. Proving criminal intent is the most challenging aspect of prosecuting white-collar fraud. My father was handing me the proof of his intent on a silver platter. I just needed him to be slightly more specific. I crafted my reply with the clinical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. I intentionally adopted a defeated, submissive tone. I typed that I was feeling overwhelmed by the pressure and wanted to avoid any public scandal that might tarnish the family name. I wrote that before I could sign the loan guarantee, I needed to calculate my exact financial exposure to ensure my personal budget could absorb the risk. I asked him to reply and confirm the precise dollar amount he had utilized from the memorial account for the Hawaiian trip, so I could adjust my banking limits accordingly. I clicked send and waited. The trap was baited with his favorite lure, which was my perceived surrender. I watched the clock on my computer screen. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I knew he was sitting in his study reading my response and smiling at his apparent victory. He would view my request for a specific number as the final concession of a beaten opponent. The reply notification chimed. I opened the message. Charles had fallen for the bait entirely. Blinded by hubris and an utter lack of digital literacy, he responded with exact figures. He typed out the precise $28,000 sum, confirming he had diverted the funds to cover the resort fees, the flights, and the catamaran charter. He reiterated his demand, instructing me to secure the boat loan by Friday, or face the social consequences of his fabricated story. I stared at the screen, analyzing the text. He had just provided a time-stamped written confession of felony embezzlement and wire fraud. He explicitly admitted to draining a registered pediatric cancer charity and using the proceeds for a tropical vacation. He tied the theft directly to his extortion attempt, proving premeditated criminal intent beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt. There was no defense attorney in the state of South Carolina who could spin this email chain into an innocent misunderstanding. I downloaded the entire correspondence, formatting it into a secure, unalterable file. I opened my encrypted communication portal and drafted a direct message to the lead investigator at the Attorney General office. I attached the email thread, labeling it as an addendum to the previously submitted financial dossier. I added a brief note explaining that the primary suspect had just confirmed the misappropriation of funds in writing. I pressed send. The digital file vanished into the ether, traveling through secure servers to land directly on a prosecutor's desk. The evidentiary loop was now closed. The impending gala was no longer merely a social event. It was the designated stage for a legal reckoning. I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of iced water. I had done everything within my power to secure justice for my son. The final act of this tragedy was entirely out of my hands, and I was perfectly content to sit back and watch the performance unfold. The Spring Memorial Gala took place in the grand ballroom of a historic luxury hotel located in the heart of downtown Charleston. The venue served as a fortress of Southern tradition, featuring vaulted ceilings, gilded mirrors, and towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and pale pink peonies. The air buzzed with the low melodic hum of a string quartet playing classical arrangements in the corner. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays, offering champagne and delicate appetizers to the milling guests. The attendee list represented the zenith of local high society. Chief surgeons from the medical district mingled with state senators, while wealthy benefactors adorned in diamonds exchanged polite pleasantries. This was the exact ecosystem my parents worshipped. For decades, they had sacrificed their actual financial stability to secure invitations to rooms precisely like this one. They craved proximity to power and prestige. Viewing this pediatric cancer charity dinner not as a solemn occasion honoring a lost child, but as their ultimate crowning achievement, I arrived 45 minutes after the doors opened, bypassing the valet line and walking the 2 blocks from a public parking garage. My attire was intentionally subdued. I wore a structured charcoal sheath dress with simple black heels and minimal makeup. I did not want to compete with the extravagant displays of wealth illuminating the room. I wanted to remain an unseen observer. Standing near the back of the ballroom, I accepted a glass of iced water from a passing server and surveyed the crowd. The clinical detachment I utilized daily at the hospital served me well tonight. I assessed the opulent surroundings, recognizing the grotesque disparity between the lavish celebration and the grim reality of the pediatric oncology ward where my son had spent his final days. Leo used to despise wearing the stiff button-down shirts my mother forced him into for family holiday photos. He preferred soft cotton superhero pajamas and the quiet comfort of his own bedroom. The stark contrast between my genuine mourning and the superficial pageantry unfolding before me solidified my resolve. The trap was armed and the main attractions were about to take center stage. A sudden shift in the ambient noise signaled their arrival. Charles, Patricia, and Vanessa did not merely enter the ballroom, they descended upon it. They moved with the synchronized grace of a royal procession. Patricia wore the sapphire silk gown she had proudly modeled in her dining room, the rich fabric catching the chandelier light with every calculated step. Charles wore a bespoke tuxedo that masked his mounting debts, projecting the aura of a successful tycoon. Vanessa trailed slightly behind them, draped in a backless emerald dress, holding her smartphone at a precise angle to capture content for her followers. All 3 of them sported deep golden tans, a glaring souvenir from the Hawaiian vacation they had purchased with stolen donations. They wasted 0 time mingling with the general attendees at the perimeter. They charted a direct course toward the designated media corner, where a photographer from the City Society magazine was snapping pictures of the primary donors. Watching my family interact with the press felt like observing a bizarre psychological experiment. Patricia perfected a facial expression of tragic nobility. She rested her head delicately against my father's shoulder, gazing into the camera lens with a practiced, sorrowful smile. Charles wrapped a protective arm around her waist, embodying the stoic, resilient patriarch guiding his flock through unimaginable grief. Vanessa stood on his other side, managing to look simultaneously mournful and fiercely glamorous, ensuring the lighting highlighted her best angles. They were staging a masterpiece of visual deception. They were utilizing the memory of a dead 7-year-old boy to elevate their social standing, securing their place in the coveted glossy pages of next month's local lifestyle publication. From my vantage point near the rear exit, I watched them work the room. Several prominent doctors and local politicians stopped to shake my father's hand, praising him for his remarkable philanthropic dedication. Charles accepted their accolades with humble nods, feigning a quiet humility that belied his profound arrogance. He truly believed he had outsmarted the system. He operated under the delusion that my silence over the past few days meant I had capitulated to his extortion. He assumed I had quietly wired my own salary to the elementary school district, replacing the embezzled funds to protect his precious reputation. He felt invincible. He even stopped to chat with a regional bank executive, casually discussing the marine market and his upcoming plans to purchase a new boat. The hubris required to discuss luxury purchases funded by extortion while standing at a cancer charity event was staggering. At the front of the room, the main stage was set for the evening presentation. A wooden podium stood in the center, illuminated by a bright spotlight. Leaning against the wall just behind the podium was a large rectangular object, covered by a velvet drape. It was the giant novelty check waiting to be unveiled. The school intended to call the family up to present this symbol of generosity to the parents of the newly selected scholarship recipient. My family firmly believed they would be walking up those steps basking in the adoration of high society and cementing their legacy as local heroes. Patricia spotted me standing by the heavy velvet curtains near the coat check. The tragic mask dissolved for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sharp, predatory glare. She excused herself from a conversation with the wives of the hospital board directors and navigated through the crowd toward my position. She moved smoothly, nodding at acquaintances along the way, but her eyes remained locked onto me with a cold, territorial intensity. She invaded my personal space, stopping inches from my face so her words would not carry over the classical music. She smelled of expensive gin and imported floral perfume. She reached out and grasped my upper arm. Her manicured fingernails dug into the fabric of my dress with surprising strength, trying to physically enforce her dominance. She leaned in close, grazing my ear. She delivered her final warning in a venomous whisper. She ordered me to mingle with the guests and display a proper level of gratitude. She commanded me to smile, look grateful, and do not dare ruin this evening for us. She explicitly stated that they were scheduled to be called up to the main podium right after the dinner service concluded. Patricia envisioned a standing ovation from the most influential people in Charleston. She demanded that I play the role of the quiet, supportive daughter standing in their shadow, while they accepted the glory of a donation they had already drained. I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I raised my eyes to meet her fierce gaze. My heart maintained a steady, resting rhythm. I offered her a single, obedient nod. I did not speak a word. The silence was my final gift to her. Patricia released her grip, satisfied with my apparent submission. She smoothed the front of her sapphire gown and glided back toward the center of the ballroom, ready to claim her spotlight. I lifted my glass and took a slow sip of the cold water. The ice clinked softly against the crystal rim. I turned my attention away from the glittering crowd and fixed my gaze on the heavy oak double doors at the back of the venue. The dinner service was about to commence. The speeches would soon follow. I knew exactly what was hidden beneath the pristine surface of this event, and more importantly, I knew exactly who was scheduled to walk through those heavy wooden doors before the night was over. The clatter of sterling silver against fine china slowly subsided, as the catering staff swiftly cleared the dessert plates from the tables. A hush fell over the grand ballroom when the chandelier lights began to dim, casting long, dramatic shadows across the floral centerpieces. The string quartet stopped playing, allowing a heavy, expectant quiet to settle over the hundreds of attendees. At the front of the room, a side door opened, and a single file line of elementary school students walked onto the stage. They wore matching uniforms and carried sheet music, stepping onto the risers with nervous energy. The room grew so still I could hear the rustle of the velvet curtains. This was the moment the entire evening had been building toward. A young music teacher raised her hands, and the children began to sing. Their high, fragile voices filled the cavernous space with a tribute song dedicated to my son. The melody was simple, but it carried a profound weight that seemed to press down on the chests of everyone present. I stood near the exit, cloaked in the dim lighting, and let the music wash over me. For a brief moment, the clinical armor I had worn all week cracked, letting the raw, unadulterated reality of my loss bleed through. I thought about Leo. I remembered his bright, mischievous eyes and the way his laugh used to echo down our hallway before the illness took his energy. The lyrics the children sang spoke of angels and memories, but my memories were not dressed in poetic metaphors. My memories consisted of sterile oncology wards, the harsh beep of heart monitors, and the metallic smell of rubbing alcohol. I recalled the grueling nights sitting in a plastic hospital chair holding his fragile hand, while the chemotherapy ravaged his tiny body. I remembered the exact moment the pediatric specialist walked into our room with a downward gaze, delivering the news that the treatments had failed. During those harrowing final weeks, my parents were conspicuously absent. They claimed hospitals gave them severe anxiety, choosing to send expensive fruit baskets instead of offering their physical presence. Following his funeral, I spent 14 months navigating a dark, suffocating void. I woke up every morning to a silent house and forced myself to breathe, to walk, to function in a world that felt fundamentally broken. I carried the crushing burden of a mother who outlived her child entirely alone. While I attended weekly grief counseling sessions and clung to the few physical items Leo left behind, my family was busy planning a tropical getaway. They utilized my devastation as a fundraising tool, harvesting the goodwill of teachers and second graders to finance a luxury vacation. They took the very funds intended to honor his short life and funneled them into private catamaran tours and premium cocktails. I shifted my gaze from the stage to the premier table positioned prominently near the front. Charles and Patricia sat illuminated by the soft glow of the stage lights. Their behavior was a grotesque pantomime of sorrow. As the children sang, my mother dabbed the dry corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, ensuring the prominent wives of the city councilmen seated nearby noticed her performance. She leaned her head against my father's shoulder, playing the part of the fragile, grieving matriarch to perfection. She was absorbing the ambient sympathy of the room, soaking it up like parched earth receiving rain. Charles was equally engrossed in the theatrical production. He sat tall, projecting an image of stoic resilience. I watched him casually adjust his silk bow tie and smooth the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. He was preparing himself for the main event. He leaned across the table and whispered something to Vanessa. My sister immediately retrieved her smartphone from her designer clutch, adjusting the camera settings and checking the angle. She wiped a smudge from the lens and propped her elbows on the table, ready to capture high-definition footage of our father accepting the monumental check. She intended to upload the speech to her social media channels, knowing a video of her weeping father would generate thousands of lucrative views and secure her pending sponsorship deals. The juxtaposition between the pure, innocent voices of the choir and the toxic vanity of my relatives turned my stomach. They felt no remorse for the felony they had committed because they truly believed the money belonged to them. They viewed the $28,000 as a rightful inheritance, a payout for the inconvenience of having a sick grandson. They were poised to walk up the carpeted stairs, shake hands with local dignitaries, and accept the roaring adulation of Charleston high society. The sheer audacity of their anticipation was breathtaking. They were eagerly awaiting a coronation that I had already transformed into a legal execution. The choir finished the final verse. The last lingering note hung in the air before dissolving into the vast ballroom. The silence held for a poignant heartbeat before the crowd erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. Wealthy donors wiped real tears from their cheeks, deeply moved by the performance. Charles stood up from his chair, clapping enthusiastically, while Patricia offered a weak, brave smile to the surrounding tables. The illusion was flawless. To the untrained eye, they were the epitome of Southern grace under unimaginable tragedy. As the applause began to wane, the children filed off the stage, returning to their proud parents in the audience. The spotlight shifted, focusing tightly on the wooden podium at the center of the platform. The large rectangular object covered by the velvet drape loomed in the background, waiting to be revealed. The master of ceremonies stepped forward to lower the microphone stand, adjusting it for the next speaker. My father buttoned his jacket, assuming a posture of readiness. He exchanged a confident glance with Patricia, anticipating hearing his name echo through the speaker system. Principal Diane Gable walked out from the wings. She wore a dark conservative suit, her expression unreadable. She carried a single sheet of paper in her hand. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate. She did not possess the buoyant energy she normally brought to school functions. The heavy burden of the information she was about to deliver weighed down her every movement. She approached the podium and arranged her notes. The ballroom fell into a hushed, eager anticipation. The elite guests readied themselves to witness the emotional climax of the evening. Before speaking, Diane scanned the sea of expectant faces. Her eyes swept past the wealthy benefactors, past the local politicians, and past my parents, sitting at their prime table. Her gaze traveled all the way to the back of the venue, finding me standing in the shadows near the exit doors. I maintained my rigid posture, keeping my face devoid of any expression. We locked eyes across the sprawling expanse of crystal chandeliers and white linen. In that brief, suspended moment, a silent communication passed between us. I saw the residual fear in her eyes, but I also recognized a hardened resolve. She had reviewed the digital dossier I sent her. She had consulted with the district attorneys and the state financial investigators. She knew exactly what crimes had been committed, and she knew the perpetrators were sitting merely 20 feet away from her. I offered no smile and no gesture of encouragement. I simply held her gaze, anchoring her to the undeniable facts of the situation. Diane gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was the confirmation I had been waiting for. The mechanism was armed. The safety was off. The trap was officially sprung. Diane Gable adjusted the microphone stand. A high-pitched squeal of feedback pierced the ballroom, causing several guests in the front rows to wince. The sharp noise acted as a physical reset button, snapping the audience out of their post-performance melancholy and redirecting their attention to the podium. Charles recognized the auditory cue. He placed his palms flat on the white linen tablecloth, pushing his chair back. He rose halfway to his feet, hovering in a half-crouch of practiced humility. He smoothed his tuxedo jacket, preparing to stride onto the stage the moment his name resonated through the speakers. He assumed the principal would introduce him as the grieving but generous patriarch who had heroically turned a family tragedy into a philanthropic triumph. To his right, Vanessa lifted her smartphone higher. She tapped the screen to ensure the recording icon pulsed red, securing the perfect angle to capture our father's impending glorification. She intended to upload the clip immediately, framing it as the culmination of her fabricated grief journey. Patricia sat rigidly upright, painting a serene, benevolent smile across her face. She subtly angled her posture toward the local society photographers standing nearby, ensuring her designer sapphire gown caught the ambient light. They were operating on a script they had written themselves, entirely blind to the reality that the director had just changed the play. Principal Gable did not offer the warm, welcoming smile customary for charity banquets. She grasped the edges of the wooden podium with white-knuckled intensity. Her gaze remained fixed on the prepared statement resting before her. She took a ragged breath that amplified through the sound system, echoing across the crystal chandeliers. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice did not carry the joyous celebratory tone expected for a scholarship presentation. Instead, her words emerged flat-brittle and weighted with profound sorrow. She thanked the attendees for their presence and acknowledged the beautiful tribute performed by the student choir. Then she paused. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. In a room populated by 300 high society donors, a 3-second pause feels like an eternity. Charles shifted his weight uncertainly, still trapped in his half-standing position. The confident gleam in his eyes flickered. He expected a prompt introduction, not a lingering grim hesitation. Diane looked up from her notes. She bypassed the standard philanthropic platitudes and delivered a clinical, devastating blow. She announced with devastating clarity that the Leo Prescott Memorial Scholarship would not be awarded tonight. A collective murmur rippled through the grand ballroom. The sound resembled a sudden gust of wind rustling through dry leaves. The elite guests exchanged bewildered glances. Wealthy benefactors and city councilmen lowered their champagne flutes, murmuring hushed inquiries to their tablemates. This was an unprecedented breach of protocol. In Charleston, charitable galas run on strict, predictable schedules. You dine, you weep politely at the tragedy, you present the oversized check, and you applaud. Disrupting that sequence violates the core tenets of local etiquette. My father froze. His knees remained bent, his posture suspended in a grotesque crouch. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pale, sickly pallor beneath his fresh tropical sunburn. He looked around the room, seeking an explanation, seeking a sympathetic face, but finding only profound confusion. He slowly lowered himself back onto his upholstered chair, moving as though his limbs had suddenly turned to lead. Diane did not allow the murmurs to build into a crescendo. She leaned closer to the microphone, cutting through the rising tide of whispers. She stated that 14 months ago, the children, teachers, and surrounding community of the elementary school had rallied together in the wake of unimaginable heartbreak. They had collected $28,000 through bake sales, car washes, and humble donations to honor a bright young boy taken too soon. She paused again, letting the magnitude of that community effort sink into the minds of the affluent audience. Then she delivered the surgical strike. She announced that as of yesterday morning, the official Memorial Trust account reflected a balance of $0. She stated that the funds had been depleted without authorization and without a single cent reaching the intended recipient. The ballroom descended into a suffocating vacuum. The oxygen seemed to evaporate from the vast space. The quiet was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. This was no longer a matter of poor etiquette. This was a catastrophic scandal detonating in real time. Diane held her ground at the podium, refusing to soften the impact. She informed the 300 assembled guests that the school district had handed the matter over to the authorities. She revealed that the sudden disappearance of a registered tax-exempt charity fund had triggered mandatory federal and state oversight. She spoke the precise words I had given her earlier that day. She declared that the account was currently under active investigation by the South Carolina Attorney General Charity Fraud Division for felony embezzlement and wire fraud. The impact of those legal terms striking the refined atmosphere of the country club crowd was instantaneous. In a culture where reputation serves as the ultimate currency, the mere mention of felony embezzlement functions as social poison. The attendees seated at the premier table alongside my parents physically reacted to the shockwave. The chief of surgery to my father's left subtly pushed his chair a few inches away. The wife of a prominent judge seated across the table dropped her gaze to her lap, refusing to make eye contact with my mother. The invisible boundaries of high society were redrawn in a matter of seconds. The elite crowd was actively quarantining themselves from the epicenter of the blast. Patricia sat immobilized. The serene, benevolent smile she had practiced in her dining room fractured, remaining frozen on her face like a grotesque, cracked porcelain mask. Her eyes darted wildly, absorbing the physical retreat of her peers. She realized with chilling clarity that the protective shield of her historic lineage had shattered. All the seasonal galas she had hosted, all the expensive gowns she had purchased, all the breathless social climbing she had endured over the decades evaporated in the span of 30 seconds. She was no longer a grieving matriarch. She was a prime suspect in a criminal investigation involving stolen pediatric cancer donations. Beside her, Vanessa lowered her smartphone. Her hand trembled so severely the device rattled against the silver cutlery on the table. The digital influencer who had built her entire online persona on the tragic narrative of her nephew's death recognized that she had just filmed the precise moment her own family was implicated in federal fraud. The recording she intended to use for lucrative sponsorships was now potential digital evidence. The color rushed out of her cheeks, leaving her looking small and terrified. She slid the phone into her designer clutch as if trying to hide the instrument of her vanity. Charles stared straight ahead, his jaw working furiously, but producing no sound. He was a man who had built his entire identity on control and financial manipulation. He had always believed he could talk his way out of any deficit, charm any creditor, and leverage his family name to escape accountability. He had assumed his unauthorized withdrawal was a private domestic issue that I would handle quietly. He never anticipated standing in front of the mayor, the hospital board, and the wealthiest families in the state, while a public school principal labeled his actions a felony. He looked like a pilot who had just realized the aircraft had no engines. I remained standing in the shadows near the exit doors, observing the precise execution of the legal trap. My clinical training allowed me to process their destruction without a single shred of pity. I analyzed their physiological responses, noting the rapid breathing, the rigid postures, the undeniable terror. They had weaponized my dead child to finance a luxury vacation, and now the system was holding them accountable. The justice I sought was not rooted in theatrical revenge. It was rooted in cold, undeniable facts. The silence in the ballroom reached a breaking point. The elite guests shifted uncomfortably, waiting for someone to restore order to the shattered evening. The collective gaze of the room instinctively drifted toward the premier table, waiting for the Prescott family to respond to the catastrophic allegations. Patricia, realizing that her entire world was dissolving before her very eyes, could not tolerate the crushing weight of their judgment. Her narcissistic conditioning demanded she seize control of the narrative before the damage became permanent. I watched her hands grip the edge of the tablecloth. Her knuckles turned white as she prepared to stand up and attempt the impossible task of deflecting blame for a crime she had already confessed to in writing. The trap had sprung successfully, but the desperate animal caught inside was about to thrash wildly against the steel jaws. The harsh scrape of wooden chair legs against polished marble fractured the suffocating quiet of the ballroom. Patricia forced herself to stand. Her knees visibly trembled beneath the hem of her sapphire gown, but decades of rigorous country club conditioning overrode her physiological panic. In her world, a scandal only became real if you stopped smiling. She pressed her palms flat against the linen tablecloth to steady her shaking hands, and tilted her chin upward. She emitted a high-pitched, trilling laugh that sounded brittle and frantic, echoing off the vaulted ceilings like breaking glass. She projected her voice across the room, adopting the breezy, condescending tone she typically reserved for scolding tardy valet attendants. She addressed the principal directly, waving a manicured hand, as though brushing away a persistent insect. She declared what a dreadful administrative mix-up this all was. She assured the mayor, the hospital board directors, and the wealthy philanthropists staring at her that the missing funds were simply the result of a tedious bureaucratic glitch. She spun a frantic narrative about frozen assets and delayed institutional wire transfers, attempting to weave a safety net out of pure delusion. The crowd did not offer sympathetic nods. The elite guests remained frozen, trapped in the uncomfortable spectacle of a matriarch unraveling in real time. Realizing her initial tactic was failing to disarm the tension, Patricia pivoted to a darker, more familiar strategy. For my entire existence, she had utilized me as the designated repository for her failures. Whenever a social slight occurred, or a household duty was neglected, she instinctively pointed her finger in my direction. She decided to deploy that lifelong habit to save herself in front of Charleston high society. Her voice dripped with a manufactured maternal pity as she addressed the silent room. She explained that her eldest daughter oversaw the administrative details for the memorial trust. She touched her chest, feigning a tragic sigh. She told the prominent attendees that I was still so overwhelmed by the crushing grief of losing my little boy that my mental faculties had slipped. She painted a picture of a distraught, unstable mother who had simply misfiled a stack of banking forms. She publicly sacrificed my professional reputation and my sanity to purchase her own innocence. That was the final necessary fracture. Any microscopic fragment of hesitation I harbored evaporated. I pushed my shoulders back and stepped out from the shadows of the exit doors. My low-heeled shoes clicked a steady rhythmic cadence against the hardwood border of the room. The sound drew the attention of the guests seated near the rear. As I walked down the center aisle, the sea of attendees instinctively parted. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in designer dresses stepped back, clearing a direct path toward the premier table. I did not rush. I maintained a measured, purposeful stride, matching the pace I use when walking into a chaotic emergency triage unit. I stopped exactly 10 feet from where my parents sat. The stage spotlight caught the edge of my charcoal dress, illuminating me in the center of the ballroom. Patricia noticed my approach, and her frantic monologue stuttered to a halt. Her eyes widened in sheer terror, realizing her chosen scapegoat was no longer willing to absorb the blame. She silently pleaded with me, using a desperate, wide-eyed stare, commanding me to play my assigned role and corroborate her fabricated story. Charles gripped the edge of the table, his face a pale, sickly gray. He recognized the cold calculation in my posture. I did not yell. Raising my voice would only feed her narrative that I was an unstable, grieving mother. I utilized the resonant, authoritative timbre I employ during hostile hospital board meetings. My voice carried effortlessly across the vast, silent space, slicing through the lingering tension. "There is no error, Mom." The words struck the premier table with physical force. Patricia's mouth opened, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. I kept my gaze locked intensely onto hers, stripping away every layer of her southern facade. "You spent $28,000 of cancer charity funds on a catamaran in Maui." A collective visceral gasp erupted from the surrounding tables. It was a raw, unfiltered sound of revulsion. The mayor lowered his head, rubbing his temples in dismay. The chief of surgery stared at my father with undisguised disgust. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I needed her to understand the exact mechanism of her destruction. I needed her to know that her extortion attempt had provided the very ammunition required to finalize her ruin. "I did not cover it up for you. I sent your written confession to the state auditors." The impact of that final sentence annihilated the Prescott illusion permanently. The social execution was instantaneous and devastating to witness. The unwritten rules of their elite ecosystem activated with ruthless efficiency. Proximity to a scandal of this magnitude equates to complicity, and the prominent citizens of Charleston moved swiftly to protect their own reputations. The physical recoil of the attendees was undeniable. The influential couples seated at the tables immediately adjacent to my family began to shift. The screech of chairs sliding backward echoed through the venue. Wealthy benefactors physically inched their bodies away from Charles and Patricia, treating them as though they were radiating a lethal contagion. The invisible barrier of social exile slammed down, isolating my parents and my sister in a sterile quarantined zone of disgrace. Vanessa shrank down into her seat, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. The influencer who craved the spotlight now desperately wished to become invisible. Her emerald dress seemed to lose its luster as she buried her face in her hands, realizing her digital empire was built on a foundation of documented felonies. Charles remained paralyzed, trapped in his chair, unable to formulate a single defense. The man who prided himself on controlling every room he entered was rendered entirely mute by the undeniable weight of his own written admission. Patricia stood alone in the wreckage of her vanity. The sapphire silk gown she had purchased to accept the adulation of her peers now served as a glaring beacon of her greed. She looked toward her country club friends, seeking a lifeline, seeking someone to intervene on her behalf. Her affluent peers turned their faces away, fixing their eyes on their empty dessert plates or staring blankly at the floral centerpieces. They severed their ties to her without speaking a single word. I stood my ground, watching the architecture of their privilege collapse into dust. I felt no triumphant joy. I experienced a clean, chilling equilibrium. I had defended the legacy of a 7-year-old boy who loved superhero pajamas and hated hospitals. I had protected the hard-earned money donated by kind-hearted teachers and innocent classmates. I had secured justice using the very system my parents believed they were immune to. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and expectant. The guests remained glued to their seats, processing the staggering reality of the confrontation. The social death of the Prescott family had been executed flawlessly, but the true legal reckoning was still waiting in the wings. I slowly shifted my gaze toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the ballroom, knowing the final act of this tragedy was about to commence. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the grand ballroom swung inward, separating with a resounding thud that echoed across the silent room. 4 individuals stepped across the threshold. They did not wear designer gowns or bespoke tuxedos. They wore dark utilitarian suits bearing the unmistakable rigid posture of state investigators. 2 uniformed Charleston police officers flanked them, taking up positions by the exits and folding their hands in front of their duty belts. The visual contrast between the glittering crystal chandeliers and the stark arrival of law enforcement drained the remaining oxygen from the venue. In this jurisdiction, stealing from a certified charitable trust is a profound offense. The local justice system takes a remarkably harsh stance on individuals who exploit philanthropic organizations. My meticulous documentation had eliminated any need for a prolonged preliminary inquiry. By providing the exact financial ledgers, the cross-referenced resort receipts, and my father's explicit written admission, I handed the Attorney General a trial-ready package. The prosecutors had petitioned a judge for immediate action, citing the severe flight risk and the ongoing dissipation of stolen assets. The legal machinery moved with breathtaking speed. The lead investigator walked down the center aisle. His hard leather shoes clicked against the polished hardwood floor, bypassing the tables of terrified socialites. He stopped directly in front of my parents. He produced a folded document from his breast pocket and spoke in a low, authoritative tone. He addressed Charles and Patricia, requesting that they accompany him outside for formal questioning regarding the Leo Prescott Memorial Fund. Charles attempted to deploy his customary charm. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie, and lowered his voice into a patronizing register. He insisted there had been a trivial misunderstanding. He offered to call his personal attorney and settle the minor discrepancy over golf the following morning. He reached out to pat the investigator on the shoulder, attempting to leverage the familiar old boys network that had always shielded him. The investigator stepped back, avoiding the physical contact. He stated clearly that this was not a negotiation. He informed my father that an active warrant had been issued for the seizure of his financial records and electronics. He instructed Charles to proceed to the exit immediately, or face public restraint. The threat of being handcuffed in front of the mayor dismantled my father's remaining bravado. Then the pristine facade of Southern etiquette shattered entirely. Faced with the reality of criminal charges, Charles turned his back on decades of marriage to save his own skin. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my mother. He told the investigator and the surrounding crowd that Patricia was solely responsible for managing the memorial accounts. He loudly proclaimed that she had booked the luxury flights and orchestrated the resort payments without his knowledge. Patricia gasped, her face flushing a deep mottled crimson. The fragile, elegant matriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate woman. She shrieked across the table, abandoning any pretense of decorum. She yelled that Charles had forged the digital authorizations himself to secure a down payment on a luxury center console boat. They began tearing each other apart, right there in the center of the ballroom, exchanging vicious accusations, while the elite citizens of Charleston watched in stunned silence. Their loyalty to one another evaporated the second their social standing was threatened. The lead investigator raised a hand, silencing their petty squabble. He firmly instructed them both to start walking. Patricia picked up her designer clutch with trembling fingers. She looked at the faces of her affluent peers, searching for a single, sympathetic gaze. She found nothing but averted eyes and cold rejection. The women she had hosted at lavish garden parties now stared at their dessert forks, refusing to acknowledge her existence. The investigators escorted my parents down the center aisle. It was a slow, excruciating procession. They walked past the chief of surgery, past the prominent local judges, and past the wealthy benefactors they had spent decades trying to impress. The walk of shame stripped away their pristine social reputation piece by piece. I watched them pass by my position near the shadows. Neither of them looked at me. They were not mourning the destruction of our family bond. They were mourning the sudden death of their status. They grieved the loss of my obedience and the convenience of my silence. They were devastated that their designated scapegoat had finally refused to carry their sins. Vanessa remained seated at the premier table. She watched her parents being ushered toward the exit, her mouth hanging open in sheer terror. For her entire adult life, she had floated on the financial currents provided by Charles and Patricia. She possessed no practical skills and no genuine career, relying entirely on her curated digital persona to secure free merchandise and social validation. The second investigator turned his attention back to her. He requested her smartphone, stating it was now classified as physical evidence in an active federal wire fraud investigation. Vanessa clutched the device to her chest. She burst into genuine, frantic tears. She was not weeping for the memory of her nephew or the pain she had caused her sister. She wept because she realized her heavily monetized grief vlog explicitly tied her to the embezzled funds. She understood that surrendering her phone meant turning over the passwords, the direct messages, and the sponsored brand deals that formed her entire identity. The investigator extended his hand, waiting patiently until she reluctantly placed the device into his palm. The loss of her digital connections severed her from the only world she valued. Her online presence would soon be flooded with the scandal, rendering her a permanent outcast in the influencer community. I stood near the velvet curtains and observed the wreckage. I did not experience a rush of triumphant joy. There was no euphoric cinematic victory pulsing through my veins. I felt only the clean, stark reality of justice running its natural course. The disease had been excised from my life. The toxic elements that had drained my energy and exploited my tragedy were being forcibly removed. My clinical training allowed me to view their departure as a necessary medical procedure. You do not celebrate the removal of an infection, you simply feel profound relief that the body can finally begin to heal. As the heavy oak doors closed behind the investigators, sealing my parents' fate, the silence in the ballroom shifted from shock to a lingering, heavy sorrow. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the devastating collateral damage remained. The principal still stood at the wooden podium, gripping the edges with pale hands. The ceremonial novelty check sat covered by the velvet drape, holding zero value. A second-grade boy diagnosed with a rare bone cancer was still waiting for the financial assistance his struggling family desperately needed to cover his out-of-state medical treatments. My parents were facing indictments, but the innocent child was facing a delayed treatment schedule. The legal system had provided accountability, but it could not instantaneously provide restitution. The money was still gone. I looked at Diane Gable, standing under the harsh spotlight, looking defeated and exhausted by the night's revelations. The crowd began to murmur in hushed, guilty tones, unsure of how to proceed with a charity gala that possessed no charity. The burden of fixing the shattered evening now rested heavily in the center of the room. The guests looked around, waiting for someone to offer a solution to the tragic deficit. I adjusted the strap of my purse and stepped fully into the light, knowing the resolution required one final decisive intervention on my part. The grand ballroom remained suffocatingly quiet after the heavy oak doors sealed my family outside with the state investigators. The master of ceremonies stood frozen near the wooden podium, unsure how to conclude a charity banquet that no longer possessed any charitable funds. The elite attendees stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact with the stage, and whispering in hushed, horrified tones. I did not linger to watch the wealthy benefactors awkwardly shuffle toward the coat check. I turned and walked out through the side exit, stepping into the warm Charleston night. I possessed a very specific administrative task to complete, and I preferred to handle it in the sterile daylight of a professional setting. The drive home felt different than any journey I had taken over the past 14 months. The oppressive weight of my family's expectations had vanished, leaving behind a crisp, clear void. The following morning, I drove to the elementary school. I signed the visitor log at the front desk and walked down the brightly lit corridor toward the administrative wing. The cinder block walls were decorated with colorful construction paper projects, creating a stark visual contrast to the dark, opulent ballroom from the previous evening. The air smelled of floor wax and sharpened pencils. I knocked once on the door to the principal office and let myself in. Diane Gable sat behind her desk looking thoroughly exhausted. The legal fallout from the gala had undoubtedly consumed her entire morning. She offered a weary smile, gesturing for me to take a seat opposite her desk. I declined the chair. I unclasped my leather briefcase and retrieved a crisp rectangular slip of paper. I placed my personal bank check directly onto the center of her desk blotter. Diane looked down at the written figures. Her breath hitched in her throat. The check was made out to the Ariadne Prescott Memorial Scholarship Fund in the exact amount of $28,000. As a medical and health services manager operating in the upper echelons of healthcare administration, I earned a lucrative salary. I lived a quiet, modest life, devoid of luxury vacations or designer wardrobes. I had accumulated significant liquid savings over the years. I informed Diane that the legal system would eventually force my parents to pay restitution, but the second-grade boy battling rare bone cancer did not possess the luxury of waiting for the judicial bureaucracy to turn its gears. He needed travel funds for his out-of-state medical treatments today. I told her the money was a direct transfer from my personal accounts. I was not covering up a crime for my parents. The state investigators already possessed the unalterable evidence of the felony. I was simply ensuring my son's legacy remained untarnished by the greed of his grandparents. Diane stood up, tears spilling over her eyelids, and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. I accepted the embrace, feeling the final lingering knot of tension dissolve from my chest. The subsequent weeks unfolded with the predictable, rigid mechanics of the criminal justice system. The South Carolina Attorney General did not offer leniency to individuals who embezzled pediatric cancer donations. Charles and Patricia were formally indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and felony embezzlement. The local media seized the story, broadcasting their booking photographs across the evening news cycles. Charles looked haggard and deflated, stripped of his bespoke tuxedo and his arrogant swagger. Patricia stared into the camera with hollow, terrified eyes, resembling a woman who had just watched her entire universe collapse. The glossy society magazines that my mother had spent her entire adult life courting published scathing editorial pieces about the profound betrayal of community trust. The swift, brutal nature of Charleston high society enacted its own distinct form of punishment. The elite country club revoked their membership, citing a strict morality clause in the bylaws. Their wealthy friends blocked their phone numbers and returned their correspondence unopened. The prominent surgeons and local politicians they had dined with pretended they had never met them. When Patricia attempted to visit her favorite downtown salon, the receptionist politely informed her that her appointments had been canceled indefinitely. They were rendered social ghosts in a city that only values reputation and pedigree. The invisible barrier of exile trapped them, isolating them from the only ecosystem they knew how to navigate. The financial devastation followed closely behind the social ruin. Retaining high-powered defense attorneys required an immediate influx of liquid capital. Because the state had frozen their compromised bank accounts pending the fraud investigation, my parents possessed only one remaining asset of significant value. They were forced to list the historic South of Broad estate on the real estate market. The sprawling white colonial home with the wraparound porch and the ancient oak trees sold at a steep loss to a commercial developer. My parents packed their remaining heirlooms into rented moving trucks and relocated to a small anonymous apartment in a different county. They lost the only currency they ever truly cared about. They traded their pristine generational facade for the cold, grim reality of a criminal docket. My sister discovered that the internet is a merciless tribunal. The digital influencer community she had relied upon for income and validation turned against her the moment the fraud became public knowledge. Investigative bloggers cross-referenced her Hawaiian vlog with the dates of the stolen charity funds. Her comment sections flooded with intense public outrage. Former followers dissected her fabricated grief journey, exposing the shallow, performative nature of her sorrow. The boutique lifestyle brands and swimwear lines that had sponsored her content immediately terminated their contracts, issuing public statements distancing themselves from her brand. Vanessa attempted to post a tearful apology video, claiming ignorance of the financial origins of her vacation, but the audience rejected her excuses. The digital backlash grew so severe, she was forced to delete her profiles entirely. The glowing screens that had provided her with a false sense of superiority went dark, leaving her to face her bleak reality without a single online admirer to validate her existence. I did not attend their preliminary hearings. I did not answer the sporadic, desperate voicemails my father left on my answering machine begging for character references or short-term financial loans. I blocked their phone numbers and instructed my clinic receptionist to turn them away if they ever appeared at my workplace. I felt no obligation to witness their suffering in the courtroom. I had performed the necessary diagnostic work, excising a terminal infection from my life, and I possessed zero desire to examine the discarded tissue. My focus returned entirely to my career managing outpatient clinics and ensuring regulatory compliance across the healthcare network. The quiet discipline of my profession provided a soothing, structured sanctuary, far removed from the chaotic destruction of my former family. 6 months after the gala, I sat on the back porch of my own home. My property is situated away from the historic downtown district, bordering the expansive South Carolina marshlands. The setting sun cast long golden rays across the tall seagrass, painting the tidal creeks in brilliant shades of amber and violet. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. A gentle evening breeze rustled the palmetto fronds overhead. I rested my hands against the cool glass of a condensation-covered tumbler filled with iced sweet tea. The silence surrounding my house was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a repressed family secret. It was the light, breathable stillness of a life lived with profound integrity. I watched a white egret glide low over the winding waterways, dipping its wings toward the current. I thought about Leo. I realized with a sudden, piercing clarity that my clinical detachment had never been a symptom of coldness. It was a vital survival mechanism. I could not save my bright, beautiful boy from the illness that ravaged his cells. I could not cure the moral rot that corrupted my parents and my sister. But I possessed the power to protect the fragile legacy my son left behind. I had utilized my professional expertise to shield his memory from exploitation. I had rejected the toxic demands of Southern honor, choosing the cold, irrefutable truth instead. In Charleston, families will endure unimaginable psychological torment just to keep their skeletons hidden securely inside their antique closets. They will smile through extortion and betray their own children to maintain a flawless public portrait. I broke that generational cycle. I let the portrait shatter into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. By refusing to serve as the silent, obedient architect of their grand illusion, I dismantled the prison they had built around me. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my sweet tea, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. The sun dipped below the marsh horizon, leaving behind a vibrant, glowing twilight. I was finally alone, and for the first time since my son drew his last breath, I was entirely free.
We spend our lives building. We construct careers, assemble homes, and carefully curate the narratives we present to the world. But the most vital architecture we ever design is the invisible framework we build within our children. When we look at the sudden, catastrophic ruin of the Prescott family, a historic Charleston name reduced to federal indictments over a stolen pediatric cancer fund, we aren't just looking at a true crime story. We are looking at a tragic, multi-generational failure in parenting. It is a chilling mirror held up to American culture, asking us a very uncomfortable question. What do we truly value when the heavy mahogany doors are closed and the gala lights finally go dark? Ariadne's story is not just a tale of cold, calculated justice. It is a profound, echoing warning about the legacies we leave behind. Through the wreckage of her family, we are forced to confront the core tenets of how we raise human beings and the long-term guidance we owe them. At the heart of the Prescott family's collapse is a fatal confusion between image and integrity. In traditional cultures steeped in concepts like Southern honor, there is immense pressure to maintain the facade. Charles and Patricia Prescott taught their daughters that reputation was the ultimate currency. They believed that matching designer shoes and front-row seats at charity banquets were adequate substitutes for a moral compass. But when parents prioritize the shell over the soul, they raise children who are fundamentally hollow. We must teach our children that true honor is not about what the country club whispers about you. It is about what you do when the room is entirely empty. Integrity must be the bedrock of family life. A child who learns to do the right thing even when it brings temporary shame or difficulty is a child who will never have to build their future on a fragile foundation of lies. When we look closely at the stark contrast between the two daughters in this tragedy, another crucial lesson emerges about independence versus entitlement. On one side, we have Ariadne, independent, principled, and capable of navigating the darkest storms of life with a steady hand. On the other stands Vanessa, a cautionary tale of parental overindulgence, the product of parents who mistook unconditional luxury for unconditional love. Entitlement is a quiet poison we sometimes feed our children under the guise of care. When we refuse to let our kids struggle when we hand them the rewards, without requiring the labor, we strip them of their resilience. By constantly shielding Vanessa from hardship and cleaning up her messes, her parents created an emotional and financial parasite. True parental love means giving children the tools to stand on their own 2 feet, not carrying them until their legs forget how to walk. This brings us to the twisted concept of family loyalty. For generations, traditional family structures have wielded the phrase, "blood is thicker than water," as a weapon to demand silence. Ariadne's parents tried to extort her, leveraging her love and her fear of social exile to make her an accomplice to their felony. They believed that because they were family, they were automatically entitled to her complicity. But healthy family loyalty does not mean covering up abuse, deceit, or cruelty. We must guide our children to understand that love should be rooted in mutual respect, not blind obedience. A strong family is one where members can hold each other accountable, where someone is brave enough to say, "This is wrong," and be heard. Loyalty to the family name should never supersede loyalty to basic human decency and the law. By breaking the cycle, Ariadne demonstrated the highest form of courage, the willingness to burn down a toxic family tree to protect the soil for future generations. This leads to the absolute necessity of accountability. Charles and Patricia operated under the delusion that their wealth and societal standing acted as an invisible shield against consequence. They believed that taking money from sick children would at worst result in polite, hushed whispers over cocktails. They never imagined the cold steel of handcuffs. As parents, the most dangerous thing we can do is teach our children that they are the exception to the rule. Whether breaking a window at age 7 or embezzling funds at age 60, the universal law of cause and effect must remain intact. If we constantly intervene to save our children from the consequences of their actions, we are setting them up for a devastating, catastrophic fall in adulthood. Accountability is not a punishment. It is the most crucial boundary line we draw to keep our children safe from their own worst impulses. Finally, we must examine how we process emotion and empathy in the modern digital age. Vanessa and her parents weaponized a 7-year-old boy's death, turning a profound human tragedy into content for social media clout and financial gain. They performed their grief for the cameras while spending the charity money on catamaran tours. In a world obsessed with screens and engagement metrics, we must actively teach our children the sacred boundaries of privacy and genuine human connection. Empathy cannot be a transactional tool. We have to show our kids that some tears are meant to be shed in the dark, that true support doesn't require a hashtag, and that human suffering is not a commodity to be traded for sponsorships. We must raise children whose hearts beat for the real people standing in front of them, not for the unseen audience on the other side of a lens. When the dust finally settles on the Prescott estate, when the historic home is sold to pay legal fees and the designer gowns are packed away, what is truly left? The ultimate legacy. We leave our children is not a sprawling house, a trust fund, or a prestigious surname. The only legacy that survives the fire of truth is character. A family should be a safe harbor where children learn to love authentically, not a theatrical stage where they learn to deceive the audience and each other. Stories like Ariadne's remind us of the quiet battles fought behind closed doors and the immense courage it takes to break toxic cycles. If this journey resonated with you, and if you value the raw, unfiltered exploration of family dynamics, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit, please hit subscribe and follow the channel Fluffy Revenge. We share the stories that need to be told, the ones that challenge us to look deeper into the shadows of human nature. As you turn off your screen and step back into your own life, take a moment to look around your home. Look at the faces of the people you are raising. We are all building a legacy, brick by invisible brick, choice by quiet choice. The question is, when the heavy storms of life eventually come, and they always do, will the house you built stand firm on the solid ground of truth? Or is it just another beautiful facade waiting for the wind to blow?